Welcome to the Narrate podcast, where we aim to tell God's story with our lives. We'll be continuing to post the Sunday message each week, but we want to dive a little deeper and offer some content to supplement your life with God, and that's where our Beyond Sunday series comes in. Join Adam and Narrate staff as they provide thoughtful discussions, ideas, and interviews that go beyond the message you'll hear on Sunday.
Hi, Narrate family. In the background of all things Narrate is our nearly 4-year-old exploration of more ancient forms of Christian practice and community. To that end, we wanted to offer a series of monologues, followed by question and response episodes that really aim to dive more deeply into the why behind the what, as well as some of the behind-the-scenes conversations and values currently animating us. So here's the first episode in our A People Connected to History and A People Alive series, where Adam talks about why he's chosen an Anglican identity.
So for well over a year now, I've had this growing desire to answer for myself and others this question of why am I opting for an Anglican identity? For a long time, I didn't know if it was only important to me or if it also had value for others. But obviously, by the nature of my recording right now, I've concluded maybe this can be helpful for all of us. Maybe we can stir up a conversation that isn't aimed at getting everyone to agree with me, but invites you to understand the why behind my what, and also can help you explore some stuff for yourself. And at this moment, I can boil the why down to 4 points, and my intention is to record 4 more of these, one for each point. Number 1 is my desire to be connected to something bigger than myself, my culture, and especially my contemporary moment. There's a history with Anglicanism, or an ancientness to us, that makes me feel anchored and secure. Number 2, C4SO in particular complements my passion for missiology, which is to say Anglicanism at its best is extraordinarily present to culture and is creative in its gospel expressions. Third, personally and especially professionally, I have this growing sense that I need a people from whom I feel sent and a professional community with whom I feel connected. C4SO can provide that. And number 4, and quite frankly my favorite of the 4, I'm smitten by, or you might say proud of, Anglicanism's modesty. For this podcast, I'm going to focus on Anglicanism's history. A friend recently arranged for me to meet with a guy named A.J. Sherrill. Truth be told, prior to our meeting, I'd never heard of him. I did a quick Google search, and that revealed that prior to where he's at now, which is a church in South Carolina, he was the lead pastor at a church Rob Bell planted in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Prior to that, he was in New York with another rather famous pastor named John Tyson. Turns out AJ's kind of a big deal. Prior to meeting with him on the phone, which was much to his credit, I found him on a podcast. I just kind of wanted to get to know him via that space. And on that podcast, the interviewer started the conversation by noting that AJ too had recently become Anglican, and then he asked the obvious question, why? AJ's answer was as brilliant as anything I've heard on the subject, and it summarizes my own experience quite well. The gist of what he said had to do with his desire to be part of something that was alive and connected to history. Over the years, he said, he found many things that were alive but not connected to anything outside of themselves, and many things that were connected to history but weren't particularly alive. And then he said, I found what he called a little tribe called C4SO, which is a little charismatic Anglican outpost. I loved the way he captured that, and what resonated with me was that what he said is that he was smitten by the opportunity to latch on to something both alive and connected to history. AJ's story serves as a great summary of my quest dating back to the start of COVID. In January of 2020, our Sunday attendance was over 500. In March, when we reopened after a 6-week government-mandated shutdown, it was 40-something people. The result caused me, and really our entire staff, to rethink almost everything we thought we believed about church. Up until then, my beliefs and values lent themselves to what Dr. Kirtley Knight would later describe as therapeutic, individualistic, agnostic Christianity. But something about COVID disrupted that. It called it all into question. For reasons I can't easily explain, and this is what I'm trying to do right now, is explain it, I developed this deep desire to be connected to a church more vetted by and connected to what I came to call ancient Christianity. Simultaneously, I was gifted with friends who shared my quest, a staff who took interest in my quest, a family who listened to me process all this. One of my ahas was when I was walking with a friend and I asked him something about his political views. He said, "I'm a conservative, but I'm not a Republican." That to me was unique, if not refreshing and intriguing, and I asked him to elaborate. He went on to say, "I'm conservative in the C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien sense of the word." When I pushed him a little more, he said they define their conservatism not by modern-day American politics, but because they thought to be conservative means dead people get a vote. What followed was my own exploration into reading Lewis's The Abolition of Man and then G.K. Chesterton's Orthodoxy. Both helped me develop a growing conviction for accounting for history in my own cultural context. Looking beyond just the Bible, although the Bible is obviously important, to really understand how people from outside my context understood these things. I was reminded of C.S. Lewis in his preface to Athanasius's book on incarnation when he talked about the importance of reading things outside of our lifetime. All of that really started to resonate. I also discovered in that season Alexander Schmemann's work, and especially his book, The Liturgy of Death. There again, my desire for an expression of Christian faith, which accounts for Christians from ages past, grew. I discovered the communion of saints and why that's such a powerful belief and concept. One of Chesterton's story from Orthodoxy summarizes it well for me. In there, he talks about two people walking along a path. Together, on their walk, they happen upon a wall that's serving as an obstacle to their ability to move forward. And he notes that one of them just quickly concludes, "It's in our way, let's remove it, let's take it down." But the other one, he says, no. Before we take it down, we should first figure out why it was put here. And only after we know why it was originally put here can we really ascertain whether or not it still serves a purpose. Later, I heard C.S. Lewis refer to this type of concept as chronological snobbery, which is to say, we shouldn't assume an idea is the correct one just because it appears to be the most recent. See, both Chesterton and Lewis gave great attention to the wisdom of accounting for the past as we live into the future. And yet they were both very connected to contemporary living movements of God. Prior to all of this, I was an evangelical church planter who functioned like a non-denominational pastor. I'm a natural silo builder. I love the Bible, love to read, and I have a decent connection of theological friends scattered throughout the country. But again, starting in 2020, I suddenly felt a need to grow my thoughts and convictions in a way that were more connected to history. I needed them to be more historically vetted. For a time, I fell in love with Eastern Orthodoxy. At other times, I figured if Narrate ceased to exist tomorrow, I'd start attending our local Roman Catholic cathedral. See, I knew I wanted a connection to something with deeper historical roots, but I was also aware that Narrate was proving to be on its way back from COVID. By God's grace, I was keenly aware of my responsibility to the people of Narrate and our shared mission in Helena. In fact, there was one story in particular that really sits with me. It's just stuck with me. It was in this season when I was thinking a lot about this stuff and was both excited but uneasy. I went for a prayer walk. I could take you to the spot where I was on Centennial Trail, and I had this overwhelming sense of the Spirit of God pointing out to me this reality. And it was something like this. Adam, if you were 21 years old and you didn't have a wife or kids, no mortgage, no commitments really to anyone, no community that you were a part of and that you got to be a part of leading, then you could run off and find whatever church tradition, whatever Christian tradition captured you the best, and you could throw yourself at it. But you're not. You're not 21, you're 45, and you do have these connections and commitments that I'm very proud to have. But then after the challenge, what followed was what felt like a promise. I just felt God saying, Adam, if you'll just trust me, if you'll follow my lead, I'll show you a way that allows you to honor those that you're committed to and honor your past commitments, while also honoring your own sense of integrity and a desire to pursue this with truth and honesty. Along came a guy named Dave Dewhurst. He was one of the many friends who were of tremendous help to me in this. And it was as he was leaving town, actually, I think it was one of our last in-person interactions, he just said, hey, Adam, you should check out Anglicanism. Now, to be perfectly honest with you, the only thing I knew about Anglicanism was what I learned in U.S. history around the Revolutionary War. I did remember that there was a professor at Portland Seminary that I met when I graduated the second time named Dr. Kirtley Knight. I'd never taken a class from him, but I was impressed by him. I stuck my head in Hannah's office and asked what she knew of Dr. Knight, and she loved Dr. Knight. She had taken classes from him. I reached out and asked him if we could meet, and I think it was a few weeks later we met over the phone. He asked me to just explain what was going on, and I took, 20 minutes to just kind of vomit out all of this stuff. And in the end, he said, Adam, we're seeing this over and over and over. He said, actually, what we're seeing is people who either are still animated by individualistic, kind of agnostic Christianity, or they're leaving Christianity entirely, or, and this is the first time I'd ever heard anybody use this phrase positively, or they're re-entrenching in ancient faith. He went on to say, have you heard of C4SO? And I said, no. And he began to tell me about them. And as we were talking, I found him online. And when we hung up, I found a guy named Chris McDaniel's contact. He was in charge of church extension. I emailed him. And much to Chris's credit, he emailed me back just a day or two later. We set up a time to meet. We met for the first time in October of 2022. And the rest, you could say, is history. We now meet once a month. And it's from him that I've learned so much about Anglicanism. Really what I've learned is that Anglicanism, it satiates my need for a stronger connection to the historic church, but it also honors and respects my own history with a creative, missional church. I'll address the creative mission ideas in a later episode. For now, I'd like to finally speak to how Anglicanism fulfills my need for something alive and connected to history. In his book, The Identity of Anglicanism, Paul Avis writes this, and I quote, Anglicans do not believe that their church originated with the Reformation, and in this belief they are justified. A church would not be Catholic and apostolic if it simply had been brought into being by a decision of Henry VIII or Elizabeth I. It is in the bones of Anglicans that they belong to a church that is continuous with the medieval church in the West that goes back to the apostles and the early fathers. End quote. Legend has it that Joseph of Arimathea brought the gospel to the British Isles in the 1st century. That legend is unprovable, but pretty common. But there's still no doubt that Christianity was present in the British Isles by the 2nd century. Writing about the year 200, the church father Tertullian mentions part of Britain were inaccessible to the Romans and yet had been reached for Christ. Writing 40 years later, Origen includes Britain among the places where Christians are to be found. See, Anglicans own that they have this humble connection to Henry VIII and his, at times, embarrassing decisions around marriage and divorce. But they also hold really strongly to the reality that their beginning did not start with Henry VIII. They see their beginning going all the way back to the 1st or the 2nd century. And therefore, the way Anglicans tell the story of the English Reformation has more to do with the need for proper reform than it does starting something new. See, this all resonates for me. First, because again, I have this desire to be a part of something historic and ancient. It also resonates because Anglicanism is often construed as being anti-Roman Catholic, but that's really not its heart. Many of the reforms it brought to the table have since been accepted. Personally, I carry no need to denigrate or disqualify Roman Catholicism, but the story of an English church striving to be part of the ancient, one holy Catholic and apostolic faith, and yet culturally attuned, it resonates with me because it establishes a precedent for regional expressions of ancient faith. See, Roman Catholicism would say that to be Catholic involves this connection to an unbroken line that goes all the way back to Peter. And that's fair, but that's not the way Anglicanism thinks about themselves. Anglicanism's convictions, if they can be trusted, are that Catholicity is about being united to ancient faith. It owns God's desire for a unified church, and yet it advocates for local expressions of that church. I love how one author, Christopher Cockworth, says it when he says, and I quote, "Anglicanism values multiformity, not uniformity." End of quote. So this leads to a question. How important is it that we affirm the Nicene Creed's call to confess belief in one holy, apostolic, Catholic church? See, here too is a question I would have never asked prior to 2020. Back then I had no conviction about my need to still align with the Creed's statement of belief about the church. I saw church as optional and personal faith in Jesus as the main objective. Today, I'm much more persuaded that our culture's hyper-individualism has gone too far, that it's having a negative impact on the way we live our faith, and that we would do well to value what proper Christian community is about. Back to the question that might deserve its own section. How important is it that we, that you, that I, affirm the Nicene Creed's call to confess belief in one holy Catholic apostolic church? What are those 4 words saying about the church? Well, let's get into that ever so briefly. One means one. It's a confession that there's only one church, which means, as Paul wrote to the Ephesians, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all. Holy means set apart or sanctified. The church is called to be Christ's body in the world, and as such to be composed of people who collectively live together and live for God's unique purposes. Catholic means universal, or my favorite definition, according to the whole. It's a confession that the global church and the historic church together form God's one family, and thus our local expression should align with the global and historic church. Apostolic means the faith passed on by the apostles. We have a faith that's the same as the one they carried. It confesses a need to keep the faith once passed on, and it's a call to be apostolic in our own sense of passing it on to others. See, to give the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed authority in one's life is to practice what I would call C.S. Lewis conservatism. That is to say, it's making sure that one's contemporary faith and convictions are informed by a Christian faith from outside one's culture and context. In the words of my friend Fred Nelson, this is a classic we all have to pay our fee and make our choice moment. For me, something about COVID left me a little bit skeptical of constantly deciding my social and theological positions. It created this desire in me to attach myself to something older and bigger who has its own history of making difficult decisions. It's what the Anglicans call the Great Tradition, and I love it. How does all this contribute to my decision to take on an Anglican identity? See, in my view, Anglicanism's history is such that it checks the box of a church that goes all the way back to the beginning. In my view, it's a blend of everything I learned as a church planner and everything I've learned about the value and call for historical anchoring. Anglican history tells the story of a regional expression of ancient faith. This doesn't mean all churches everywhere need to be Anglican, but rather they can look to Anglicanism as a model for forming local churches that are alive and very connected to history. I'm almost done, but listen to what page 1 of the 2019 Book of Common Prayer says. I just love this quote. Haphazardly and without centralized hierarchy or authority, what emerged in Britain, by God's grace, was a church that saw herself in each of her local manifestations as part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. And here's what I love. Culturally attuned and missionally adaptive, but ever committed to and always propagating the faith that was once and for all delivered to the saints. End of quote. Again, I love this because it attaches us to history. It keeps us from having to decide everything. It ensures that the faith that we're living is a faith that people from outside of our historical context would recognize and would themselves embrace. And yet it encourages missional creativity. See, Anglicanism, in my view, it allows me to take all that I've learned as a church planner and all that I've more recently learned as a long-standing member of the church, the historic church, and to bring them together under one roof. So there you have it. There's my 2 cents on why I see value in grabbing hold of an Anglican identity. And so here's what we want to do. If you choose to engage this, which the fact that you're listening means you have, and I understand that I'm not the best at these things, but we would love your questions. I'd love for you to email questions to adam@narratechurch.org, or you can email them directly to Hannah in her email address. And what we plan to do is in the coming days, maybe weeks, we're going to record a Q&A where in this instance, Hannah and I interact around some of your questions and some of her own questions. And then as we do later episodes, maybe it'll be other people and I doing this. So I'd be flattered by your engagement, would also understand if you're too busy. In the very least, I hope this gives you the first steps towards some insight in my own why behind the what. Thanks.
If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org.
You can also look us up on Facebook or Instagram. Thanks for listening.